Hello and welcome. So today we're going to be looking at labour supply. So labour supply is literally just the number of hours an individual is willing to work at a certain wage level. Now up until now I'll be looking at quantity and price, but actually we know that the price in the market is to do with the wage level and the quantity is to do with the hours that you are willing to work, right? So when we look at labour supply, you have to think about the idea that workers, individuals have a choice when they wake up every single morning. There are two things that they can spend their time doing. They can either dedicate their time to work or they can dedicate their time to leisure. So there is a direct opportunity cost between those two things. They can either dedicate a certain amount of hours to work or a certain amount of hours to leisure. Now labour supply is particularly interesting because there is a maximum amount of time that every single individual faces is equal, right? Every single individual has 24 hours in the day. It's not kind of like the amount of resources that are available to a business are completely different. Actually, when it comes to labour and labour supply, the resource is exactly the same. Every single worker, it doesn't matter if you're paid £1 million an hour, £15 an hour, £45 an hour, you all face the maximum amount of time that you have to dedicate, right? Which is 24 hours a day. And as the price of the wage gets higher and you're paid more an hour, you need to think about what you're giving up because your opportunity cost is going to change. So your opportunity cost is growing as the price is growing, right? Because the more time that I dedicate to work, the less time that I can dedicate to leisure. So I'm not able, if I work for 10 hours, I only have 14 hours left in a day, right? It's not like I can just add more and more time on, right? So the opportunity cost when you are working more or leisure more, the opportunity cost for the other is going to be increasing at an increasing rate. And that kind of fact creates a really interesting dynamic in the labour market and it makes labour supply particularly interesting, right? So we know that labour supply is all about the amount of kind of hours an individual is willing to work as the wage goes up, and we know that there is this opportunity cost, and that opportunity cost is increasing at an increasing rate. Now we know because of that, then that means that we are going to have an upward sloping supply curve. I mean, that's the same as any supply curve in any other market. As the price goes up, the opportunity cost of not entering the market increases, therefore people enter the market. But for the labour market, it's particularly interesting because every single individual has the same maximum number of hours that they can dedicate to anything in a day, whether that is work or whether that is leisure. And also we know that there are some things, I know there's going to be loads of questions about, oh, what about sleeping, etc, etc. Well, I mean, anything that isn't work is leisure, maybe naps are leisure. So the last thing I want to think about is think about the idea of the slope. We know that the slope of that supply curve is going to be upward sloping, but is it going to be really elastic or is it going to be really inelastic, right? And by what we're saying by that is, if there is a small change in price, is the change in quantity supplied? Is the amount of hours that you are willing to work, is it going to be increase more proportionally or less than proportionally to the change in the wage level, right? And I want you to think about the things that can affect that, and I want you to think about how that works. And a really great starting point for that is for us to think about this question here. Take a moment and think about, would you want to be a teacher? Right? I want you to think about all the things, yes or no. If it's yes, why? If it's no, why not? And I want you to think about and write down all the reasons why you would or you wouldn't want to enter that labour market, because that's essentially what we're asking is, would you want to do this job? Would you want to do that job? What we're asking you is, do you want to dedicate your scarce resource of time to entering that labour market and supplying that labour market with your hours, right? Now, some of you may be thinking about the wage, and maybe the wage of a teacher isn't that great. Well, what if I was to tell you that the starting wage for a teacher and the wage progression for a teacher is actually a lot better than a lot of other industries? Would that change your answer? Maybe for some of you it will, maybe for some of you it won't. But what I really want you to do is kind of dissect those reasons why and tell me why you wouldn't want to dedicate your scarce resource of time to entering the labour market as a teacher. And also, while you're asking yourself those questions, you might want to answer the question of, could you be a teacher? right? Not only may you want to be a teacher, but could you be a teacher? Could you dedicate your time to getting the qualifications, to learning your subject? Could you do that and enter the market as a teacher? You might want to, but whether you could or not, it's completely up to you, and we'll have a look at why in just a moment. So there's lots of things that impact the elasticity of supply of labour, and essentially they're things that, like I said, you need to ask yourself, would I dedicate my time, my scarce resource, to entering that market? And here are some of the reasons that affect the labour supply. So the first one is obviously the real wage. When we talk about real wage, we mean it is adjusted for inflation. So the real wage in a market will be able to tell you whether or not you want to enter that market, right? Because if the real wage is very low, you might not want to enter the market because the wage is lower than your leisure time, right? So the wage that is being offered is lower than the cost of your leisure time. And if the wage that you are being offered is lower than the cost of your leisure time, then obviously you are going to choose leisure rather than work. The next one is overtime, right? The amount of overtime that you can get. By overtime, we mean the amount of additional hours that you can be paid at a higher rate, right? So if I combine the real wage and the overtime wage, then this would equal your income, right? Your financial income. Now there are some jobs, obviously it's slightly more complicated, where you get like a salary, for instance, and therefore your working conditions are slightly different, but therefore you just get your real wage and you wouldn't have the opportunity for overtime. But these two combined equal your overall financial from work, your financial gain from work as an individual. You may have other financial gains outside of work, but this is your work. So something else that might affect your labour supply, your willingness to supply labour, might be substitute occupations. So for instance, I am a teacher, but if the price, and by price I mean the wage of a tutor, was to increase, then I might have to switch from being a teacher to a tutor. If the price of the wage of being a tutor was higher than the wage price of being a teacher, I would switch to a different occupation, right? A substitute occupation. And you might find that actually that there are a lot of industries, labour markets, where you can substitute out, but it's very difficult to substitute in. So for instance, a doctor has lots of substitute occupations. So a doctor can become a solicitor, or a doctor can leave the medical profession and become an academic. But actually the other way around, it's not so easy. So a solicitor cannot transfer their skills to enter into the labour market for a doctor, or an academic may not be able to switch into the labour market and become a medical doctor. That is as easily as the other way around. It's not impossible, but it's definitely not as easy. And that affects the market for doctors, right? It makes it more inelastic, because they know that as the price rises or as the price falls, people are going to stay being doctors, right? Because it's very inelastic supply curve. So one of the other things is to do with barriers to entry to the market. So that might be to do with regulation, it might be to do with qualification level, it might be to do with the cost of entry, the length of time that it costs you to get into the market. So again, if we think about medical professionals, medical doctors, for instance, the cost of entering the market is really high. One is heavily regulated. You have to have certain qualifications to enter the market, you have to have passed certain exams to enter the market, you have to have done a certain amount of practical time to enter the market to be able to be a fully qualified medical doctor. You have to be able to do all of those things, and actually they're really, really costly. Dedicating 7 years of your life to education, that is a cost, not just the financial cost of having to dedicate that much of your time to education, but also the cost itself of your time. Remember, the opportunity cost of your leisure, studying to be a doctor, is a huge amount of time, and that might put people who are intelligent enough to be doctors off being a doctor, because they don't want to spend 7 years of their life dedicated to education to enter that market, right? So, for instance, there might as well be lots of people who are willing to be teachers, but actually to be a teacher you have to have your PGCE. To be a fully qualified teacher you have to have your PGCE. It costs £9,000 to have a PGCE if you go down certain routes, but equally not only does it cost £9,000, it's an extra additional year of your life that you may not be earning money for, and that might put you off entering the market, right? If you do not have a fully qualified, that kind of ticket, that meet that regulation, you are not going to be able to earn as much because of the government regulation in the labour market for that industry. And also it might be to do with just the skill level. You might not have the personal attributes and the personal skills to be able to be good at that job, right? For instance, you can have a PGCE, you can have good subject knowledge, but a teacher does not make, as we all know. You have to have other certain kind of personal attributes to be able to be successful in that role, and that's the same for every single role, whether it be, you know, a bar staff or a waiter or waitress or a police officer or a, you know, solicitor or an accountant. Any job role has certain personal skills that make people particularly strong and good at that job, and if you don't have those, even if you have all of the other things, that's a barrier to entry and exit of the market, right? So it's stopping you enter the labour market for that industry. One of the other things as well is to do with the mobility of labour. So when I was talking earlier about the doctor, then that's mobility of labour. Do you have transferable skills, which means that it's very elastic or inelastic in supply, right? So if you have lots of transferable skills, like somebody who is a cocktail maker, a mixologist, may well be able to do other jobs and roles as well, very transferably, move to, you know, kind of working in the bar or working as in the restaurant or maybe even working in the kitchen. They're a very mobile unit of human capital, which means that they are able to kind of switch jobs if the price changes. So if the wage gets higher, they can switch to all of those other jobs because they have a lot of skills that allow them to do that. Other jobs, however, don't have that, right? You know, so they are very inelastic in their supply because once you've entered the market or you've dedicated all that time and that effort to entering the market, you're not actually a particularly mobile individual piece of human capital. And actually what you find is the higher the skill level to enter into a labour market, actually the more inelastic it becomes, because you actually become a less kind of transferable human capital unit because you are very specifically skilled and trained to do one job role. It might be a very important job role, it might have a very inelastic demand to it as well, but still it does affect your mobility of labour. Also, there might be some non-monetary characteristics as well. So think back to when I asked you if you wanted to be a teacher. Some of you might have been like, oh my god, I hate children. Or you might have been like, oh, you know what, like young people are just too difficult to deal with. Or it might be like people don't respect you enough. Those things are non-monetary characteristics of the job. And actually what you tend to find is that non-monetary characteristics of the job make up a huge part of your kind of utility from being in the labour market, right? And remember, the higher your utility for being in the labour market, then that's going to reduce your opportunity cost of leisure, right? I really love being a teacher, I really enjoy being a teacher, and therefore my leisure opportunity cost is going to be lower, right? So to switch back to leisure, because I get a lot of utility out of my job as an individual, right? So if the wage of a teacher falls, I'm less kind of sensitive to that because I gain a lot of utility from being in the labour market itself. So whereas if I was just in it for the money, if the wage fell, then my opportunity cost of leisure would be much higher and I would want to leave the market, right? So the non-monetary characteristics of a job are super important to the elasticity because it really affects the amount, kind of like the opportunity cost and the utility that is gained from being in a labour market. And our last one for now, there are other ones as well, but these are kind of the key ones that you want to look at, is the migration of labour, right? So immigration and emigration. If you have a lot of people leaving your economy, then obviously if you have a lot of emigration, then obviously that's going to have such a big effect on your labour supply curve, right? It's going to become more inelastic because you just don't have as many units of human capital to be able to replace or change or even enter the market in itself. Equally, it might be to do with immigration. So if you have a lot of immigrants coming over to your economy, who are entering into your economy to work, then obviously that's going to change your elasticity supply and also your ability to enter into the labour market and your labour market supply curve as kind of in any industry, right? Because the more individuals you have, and it could also be a population boom, you know, like after the Second World War, population boom had the same effect, but obviously it's going to be over a much bigger time frame. Immigration, if you have like a boom in immigration, it means that your working population increases incredibly quickly, whereas if you have a boom in your individual kind of domestic population, it's going to take a long time for that boom in your population to enter the labour market, anywhere between kind of 18 to 22 years, for obvious reasons. So immigration has the same effect as a large population change, or either an increase in your population or a decrease in your population, the same as emigration if you have a decrease in your population, but it's just a lot quicker, right? It's a lot quicker effect. And we might find that, you know, kind of when we were part of the EU, this was able to switch and change pretty rapidly, but actually now that we've left the EU, we might see some of this kind of adapting and that having a big effect on the elasticity of supply of a lot of industries, which might lead to some market failure that we will have a look at kind of a few lessons on. So I'm going to play kind of a little bit of a game, and what I want you to do is I want you to think about these 3 jobs and I want you to tell me whether you think they are elastic or whether you think that they are inelastic labour supplies, right? So you pause the video, have a go, think about the characteristics, think about the things that affect elasticity of supply, and then have a think about which one you think they use. So have a pause, off you go. So let's start off with an oil rig worker. Obviously you are away from your family for a lot of time, and remember elasticity of supply will be different for each individual, and therefore the overall elasticity of supply is the average of the entire market, right? So for an oil rig worker, you have to be away from your family. It's incredibly dangerous work, but the wage is pretty high, right? So if you think about the wage to kind of skill level that you might need to enter the market, and by skill level I mean like kind of qualification level, to enter the market, it might be that means that it's kind of maybe a little bit more supply that is elastic, but actually it's incredibly dangerous. You have to be away from your family for a reasonable amount of time, like chunks at a time, and those things make it overall, I would say, relatively inelastic, right? So the higher the wage rises, you're not going to see a more than proportional change to the quantity demanded. Right, our second one, entrepreneur. A little bit of a trick question. A lot of it depends on what type of entrepreneur. Some labour markets lend themselves to entrepreneurs very well. So for instance, a lot of like plumbers are entrepreneurs that kind of own their own small businesses, and the same with kind of like builders, etc., etc. But then other things don't lend themselves necessarily to entrepreneurship, particularly because of, again, if you think about those, mainly to do with the risk, what you're giving up, right? So if you think about kind of your opportunity cost of not being in another labour market, and by another labour market you think is being employed by somebody else, so the safety of being employed by somebody else, right? So for instance, if you are a chef and you are employed in somebody's restaurant, then that's very safe, and it actually might be an incredibly large risk for you to enter into being an entrepreneur and owning your own restaurant and working for yourself. But whereas as a builder or an independent contractor in construction, it's a lot safer. So depending on the industries, depends on whether it is inelastic or whether it might be elastic. And it might be useful for you to think about different industries that lend themselves to elastic or inelastic. Tutor, is elastic, very elastic, I would say. If you just think about it like this, so tutors are not very regulated, right? You can just sell your services as a tutor online, as students, as young individuals. You don't really need any qualifications to be able to do it. You just need to have a qualification in what you are tutoring. So that might be GCSE English. You just need to have a GCSE in English, and then you can tutor in that area, and there's no kind of like set qualification you have to have, or etc, etc. Barriers to entry are very low, skill level is very low, and therefore it's very elastic, right? If the price of tutors rises, and remember that it's a transferable industry that has a lot of qualifications, so if the price of a tutor rises, I as a teacher can enter the market, right? But whereas the other way around, it's not so much, right? If the price of being a teacher rises, the wage of a teacher rises, people who are tutors have still barriers to entry into the market, like they have to get a qualification, they have to kind of think about whether they have the skill set to deal with like 30 children all at once, etc, etc. So there are barriers to enter into being a teacher that aren't there for a tutor. So a tutor is going to be relatively elastic. So I want us to think about as well time period. Now this is really interesting. And I hope that we haven't forgotten that labour markets is what? What is the labour market? It is a factor of production, and therefore if we think all the way back to kind of last year in macroeconomics, what do we learn about factors of production and kind of their elasticity in the long run? Is that for an economy to be in the long run, at least in the classical model overall, all of your output has to be variable, right? So your factors of production has to be variable, which means that in the long run, your factors of production have to be elastic, like they have to be able to change, right? So therefore, over time, the elasticity of supply for all industries, completely theoretically, will become more elastic, right? So they might be really inelastic in the short run, but over time they will become more elastic. Now when we think about the labour market and what that actually means, it means that over time, as the mobility of labour and the geographical mobility of labour and the occupational mobility of labour changes, and we'll be dealing with those two terms just a few lessons on, the market will become more elastic. All labour markets will become more elastic, and therefore over time all of labour markets, all industries will become more variable, right? So essentially as time goes on, then all labour markets become more elastic, and you can use that in your exams. You can say that, if you're asked a question about labour markets and the mobility of labour and the elasticity of labour, you can say, however, over time, as it is a factor of production, all industries will become more elastic over the long run. Right, so next lesson we're going to be looking at shifts in labour supply and things that shift labour supply and why they shift labour supply and what effects that might have in the market. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson, and I'll see you next time. Bye!